Next, Richard Florida. Richard Florida, director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, is a deeply controversial figure who got famous for his theory that a creative class of knowledge workers was key to urban prosperity. Many cities tried to lure the creative class into their midst with mixed results. He was criticized as an elitist and an apologist for liberal appeals to the professional managerial class. I met him at a conference just after the 1987 stock market crash. We were the only two leftists in a room full of Wall Streeters. I liked him then and have continued to, even if I've got some criticisms of his work. Last year, he published a book with Basic that updated his theories: The New Urban Crisis, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. Here he is to talk about all that. Richard Florida. A few weeks ago, Hillary Clinton did some indiscreet bragging in which she said that she won the votes of regions with 2/3 of U.S. GDP. It didn't come off sounding very good, but she was onto something there, wasn't she?
Indeed. Indeed.
The production of GDP is far more highly regionalized than a lot of people might appreciate.
It wasn't always this way, but as long as I've been sort of tracking this, and other urban economists have been tracking it, what Bill Bishop famously called the big sort, the sorting of talented and ambitious people in certain places, and the unsorting or the pushing out of less ambitious or less advantaged or more disadvantaged, less educated, more disadvantaged people of other places. And at the same time, I guess Jane Jacobs taught us this. In the old industrial system, you could plant a factory just about anywhere, and not just Detroit or Pittsburgh, but a Sunbelt community, and run away from unions, if you're a management, run away from high wages. And the manufacturing economy, the industrial economy, could be more decentralized. But this new knowledge economy that we have really benefits from clustering, or what urban economists call agglomeration. So it is really kind of jam-packing itself into a small subset of metros. So I think what's happened, of course, is as these certain metros, the coastal metros, the New York, Boston, Washington, Carter, the Pacific Northwest with Seattle and Portland, the San Francisco Bay Area and LA, and a few places in between. I don't mean to make this so simplistic, but basically, as they've developed these powerful knowledge economies, which benefit from being open to immigration, which benefit from being more open-minded towards gay and lesbian people, which benefit from attracting young single people, which benefit from attracting talented immigrants, they've developed a more open-minded politics. So, the places that voted for Mrs. Clinton, like at the metro level, the two places that cast the largest percentage of votes for Mrs. Clinton were in the Bay Area, San Francisco and San Jose. And then New York and Boston and Washington. We can go on and on about that. But basically, Mrs. Clinton, like President Obama before her, captured kind of the centers of the knowledge economy, and Trump captured many more places, but he captured many of the places that are being left behind in the knowledge economy, where people are anxious about their economic situation. But I think even more than that, they're really angry at the cultural changes that they see. The fact that women are treated more fairly, that gay and lesbian people have rights, that women have reproductive rights, that immigrants are allowed to come in. I think there's this sense of, their old patriarchal white America is falling behind, and they're mad about that. So they voted for Trump. So, I think geography, or what I would even call spatial inequality or geographic inequality or geographic unevenness, underpins a lot of what we see in our politics today.
Well, this contradicts popular perception that capital is perfectly immobile and location doesn't matter like it used to, because you can do work from anywhere, and factories can move all over the place, but so can office workers move all over the place. But you're saying the contrary, that place is perhaps more important than ever.
From an interesting, because you're a good person to talk about this. If you think about Marx writing about the industrial capitalism, modern industrial capital, that capital itself, embodied in technology, embodied in factories, embodied in dead labor, was key to making this whole system run and exploiting and taking a surplus off the backs of workers. So it was very much an industrial economy which pitted these two industrial classes, bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalists and the workers. What I think has happened in the knowledge economy, and here all I've tried to do in my life work is kind of fuse a little bit of Joseph Schumpeter and a little more of Jane Jacobs onto Marx. And maybe, I've been thinking about this today, like Das Urban Capital, meaning kind of twist, a play on words, Das Urban Capital. But basically, the place itself has become the platform of this new age of knowledge capitalism, because it's not embodied in factories. It's embodied in the characteristics of places that attract this kind of knowledge worker And talent does have some more leverage. Knowledge workers have a lot more leverage than a proletarian. So capital has to pour into these places, big tech, if you will, in Seattle, in the Bay Area, has to pour into these places and kind of congregate and mobilize this force called knowledge workers, knowledge labor. Something Marx actually wrote about in the Grundrisse, but that's neither here nor there. So yeah, capital is still extremely mobile. But the fact is that one of the key factors of production is kind of lodged in space, in place. These very skilled knowledge workers, and in a way, it's not that they're a stock; they're a flow. And you need new ones all the time because these knowledge skills erode very quickly: engineering skills, computer science skills, artificial intelligence. So you need a constant flow of this knowledge-based labor, if you will, knowledge-based workers into your community. And then the firms, some of them grow very large, and many of them are tributarian and disrupted and fall apart. So capital is kind of lodged in place rather than captured in industrial corporations. I'm making that point over. Of course, industrial corporations are still very important, and the place itself becomes the platform. Sometimes I say it's supplanted the corporation. Maybe that's too strong, but the place itself becomes a platform for capitalized to mobilize this knowledge work, which is really the key source of surplus or value creation in our economy today.
I've lived for decades now in one of these hotbeds of the knowledge economy, New York City. And you mentioned earlier spatial inequality between regions, but there's certainly a lot of inequality in this particular city too. I mean, there's still an awful lot of very poor people. So the knowledge economy doesn't necessarily spread around its fruits very generously.
No, and in fact, I think, and I'm pretty in tune with this. I'm not a neoclassical economist. I'm trained as a neo-Marxist. I'm trained as a Schumpeterian. And I think even I underestimated the divisiveness of this knowledge economy. And I never believed this trickle-down Reaganistic bullshit. But looking back in the 1980s and 90s, there was this kind of romantic notion that it was a new economy and it would be more democratic. And, I think I fell for this along with a lot of other people. There's a couple of wake-up calls, that came due. One is obviously just looking at what's happened with gentrification in our cities, where these knowledge workers and professional people and the global super rich have poured in. So one of the things I like to say is that this spatial inequality is fractal. It occurs at every scale. It occurs across nations, the regions of the world. It occurs across cities and metro areas. But it's even magnified in these superstar metros like New York or London and these knowledge hubs like San Francisco. So the only good thing, or the silver lining in that, if you can say it's a silver lining, is when you get this happening in an actual city like New York or London or Paris, it's not like all of this is in an industrial park in a gated suburb with all rich, educated white people who vote Republican. A city is a contested space. And yeah, you can try to gentrify it. And yeah, you can try to remake these neighborhoods. But as you said, there is still a wide diversity of ethnic and racial groups and a wide diversity of socioeconomic groups. And people getting displaced get really pissed off. So what a guy like de Blasio is dealing with, or Sadiq Khan in London, or Anne Hidalgo in Paris, or Eric Garcetti in LA is this new contested terrain of place. And, sometimes I like to say, especially for your listeners, if the industrial corporation was the point of contestation in industrial capitalism, our cities and place itself are the point of contestation in class conflict in contemporary knowledge-based capitalism. And I end my book, The New Urban Crisis, on a realistically, optimistic note, not romantically, utopian, not optimistic. But I say the one thing of having all this stuff coming back to cities, that's a silver lining, is that people are going to get mad, these class conflicts are going to erupt, and progressive mayors will be pushed to act. Now, we need more of that, and I think a lot of these progressive mayors are full of beans. But I think we're at the beginnings of it. And as you said, a city isn't a gated suburb. It's a place that's diverse, and this inequality in cities, I think, will provoke a certain set of social movements or a certain level of contestation or class conflict that may result in better outcomes over time.
I have some confusion sometimes when you talk about knowledge workers or the creative class. Sometimes I'm not clear on whether you're talking about someone writing electronic music in a former industrial space in Bushwick, Brooklyn, or an investment banker crafting derivatives in Midtown Manhattan, or somebody writing an app in Dumbo, Brooklyn. They lead very different lives and earn very different kinds of income. So who's who in this knowledge economy?
It's a great question, and one which is at the heart of what I've grappled with all of my intellectual career. So as someone who learned Marx and is shaped by Marx, and I said a little bit by Schumpeter, a little bit by Jacobs, I like this basic division between the working class and the capitalist class. But the working class seemed not to capture, at least to me, others may argue it does, but at least in my intellectual project, the working class seemed to capture to me someone who worked with their physical labor in a factory. And if you think about that working class, I'll come back to this, it was a divided group of people. There was a group of craft workers, more artisanal, organized, in union labor history terms by the AFL, who were working a little bit more with their physical skill. And they didn't like, nor did they like being lumped together initially with these mass production workers, these unskilled, largely immigrant workers that were organized by the CIO and the mass production unions. When I started to grapple with the knowledge, I had to invent this term, the creative class. People said it was post-industrial, and that didn't seem a very good term to me. And then he said that it was a service economy. And I said, well, there are services like flipping a burger at McDonald's or, providing a personal service. And then there's all of these high-order services. So I was reading a passage in the Grundrisse one day, and this is where Marx talks about knowledge. Nature builds no locomotive. It builds no self-acting mules. It builds no machines. These are products of the human mind, of knowledge objectified. And I was like, holy, this is intersubjective knowledge work. That's a big thing he's saying a century plus ago. So basically what I tried to do was devise a schema to think about how these knowledge workers fit in to class categories. And I read a lot of Eric Wright and a lot of other people. I'm not saying my schema is right, but it was my attempt. And so what I said was there were these group of people who work with their minds, who work with their creativity. They're as diverse as the old working class. They include more people who make derivatives. They include people who work with mathematics and people who create algorithms. They include people who write software. They include people who manage other people. They include people who work in arts, music. They don't all have high incomes, like all working class people didn't have. Some had higher incomes than others. But what makes them a class is the fact that they use knowledge as their source of production, as opposed to routine physical skill or routine manual skill in providing services, non-knowledge-based skills. So that's what I did, and I said, there's about a third of the workforce, roughly speaking, as much as we can estimate this, that do this kind of knowledge work. And I said, yeah, they are very different, an artist and a business person, a professional, but they have something in common, which is their use of knowledge, and they are a new class. In many ways, they behave like a new class. This class, if you look at where they're located, tends to vote more Democratic. And a big challenge for the work, I hate to go on and on about this, is that the white working class does not. And, I don't mean to be too difficult on this, and I want dialogue with colleagues. Maybe Marx would have said the white working class has become a backward-looking class, something like the peasantry that he wrote about was a backward-looking class. And maybe there's a new class coalition to forge, which is a coalition between these knowledge workers and the even larger service class. So, 65 million Americans, 45% of our workforce work in low-end, poorly compensated, precarious, highly insecure service jobs. Maybe that's the new kind of class coalition we have to forge. So that's been my intellectual project. I'm not sure I'm 100% right. I appreciate the skepticism. I appreciate critique. But I've been trying to define this nexus of the new class structure of knowledge-based capitalism and its embeddedness in space or place.
I'm speaking with the urban theorist, Richard Florida. No, but the three paradigmatic examples I gave, the composer, the financier, and the app writer, they all have very different politics, subjectivities, material interests. Can they be harnessed together into a class?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not an organizer, and people have said the same thing about the blacksmith and the carpenter and the welder and the assembly line person. My hunch is, when I look at the data, this knowledge group tends to vote, if you aggregate them together, they tend to vote more Democratic and more small p progressive. So, yeah, I think so. I haven't looked enough at this. And the big mystery, I'm not trying to shift the question, is that, we get no real statistical correlation for the service class. We get high degree of statistical correlation between the working class and kind of Trump or Romney or McCain votes. And we get a high degree of statistical correlation between concentrations of knowledge workers across these class categories in Obama or Clinton votes, but we get nothing. Maybe it's the service class is the class we have to organize, but yeah, I don't disagree with you that there are different strata within this knowledge group. I just think they if I look at their relationship to the means of production, their relationship to the means of production is their use of knowledge. That's sort of my prior on this, and that conditions at least some part of their behavior and some part of their outlook. Not totally. There are great differences in this, but at least it gives me some analytical leverage. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means.
Now, a region that doesn't get much attention, that is having a lot of problems, are the older inner suburbs across the country. Talk a bit about them. What's going on there, and what can be done about them?
It's really interesting, as someone who cares of this kind of takes this neo-Marxian outlook, that how much space is a key category that's been to some degree ignored. David Harvey and others have looked at this in great detail, but I think our class divisions are in many ways geographic divides. And, as the wealthy and the affluent and the super rich and the capitalist class and these advantaged knowledge workers have poured back both into cities, the functional and desirable and close-in neighborhoods and cities, and still remain colonized in the beautiful greenbelt suburbs near mountaintops and great parks and, great waterfront. The working classes and the service classes have been pushed into this uber disadvantaged neighborhoods of cities and then into these older working class suburbs that used to be, that's where I come from, right? We're both from Bergen County. That's where I come from. And those used to be kind of on-ramps to upward mobility if you're a worker like my dad, seventh grade education, factory worker, moved us from Newark to North Arlington, New Jersey, on-ramp to social mobility and college education for the boys and everything. Now those places are kind of desolate. They're disconnected from the economy. They're where the working classes and new immigrant groups are concentrated. They offer less avenues for upward mobility. They're the place where opioid use and other kind of drug use is skyrocketing. They're places of distress and dysfunction. And this one guy at UCLA who studied at USC, Jeff Sellers, who studied this in great detail, says it's not swing states that matter in our national election. It's these dislocated, distressed swing burbs. One election they'll vote for Obama. The next election they'll get mad and vote for Trump. And again, I haven't looked at Sellers' work in a while, but it rings true that there are these places that people just feel no one cares about them. And they're falling behind and there's little hope for their kids. So yeah, I think it's this. We used to talk about as urbanists the hole in the donut. And the hole in the donut was Newark and Camden and Detroit and Pittsburgh in the inner city. The donut seems to have a new hole, and it's not in the center. You know what I'm saying? It's in these distressed burbs that are between the center of the city, which is gentrifying, and the outlying core of beautiful greenbelt suburbs that still have their hold on, relatively advantaged people.
A couple of decades ago, it was going to be the Edge City. Whatever happened to that?
Joel Garreau, it's a very prescient book and a very great book. I think guys like Joel Garreau and Joel Kotkin, both of whom I've argued with vociferously, I think they have a lot to tell us. I think I may disagree with some things they say, but oftentimes they have their finger on the pulse of something quite accurate. Maybe Garreau's arguing about the Edge City was appropriate for its time and maybe a bit overdrawn, that the center city would empty and we'd have these faux city centers created. But, the place he talked about, Tyson's Corner outside of D.C., is still a very wealthy place. It has among the highest incomes in the world. It has among the highest education levels in the world. It's still attracting companies and people. It's not my cup of tea, but it's attracting people. And some of these, Silicon Valley is an edge city that continues to work pretty well. The question is that some of these edge cities have developed into actual places, and many other edge cities, have been like abandoned malls. It was a phenomenon that had its day. Certain of them grew into actual places, and other of them fell by the wayside. I think the real thing that's going on, though, is there aren't a lot of places that are making it. I mentioned Tyson's Corner in Silicon Valley, but the same thing with big city centers, New York and San Francisco and Boston and Washington and Seattle. And you could say the same thing. I just wrote on rural places. There's 100 rural places. There's tens of thousands of rural places across, but 100 of them seem like they're making it in the knowledge economy. So I think that the world is spiky, or advantage is concentrated at every scale. Certain big cities are making it, certain others aren't. Certain older suburbs and beautiful suburbs are making it, others aren't. Certain edge cities are making, many are falling apart. I think that's the nature of the beast we have today. Inequality across these many, many scales.
As is typical of these things, you always say the last 5 minutes for the what is to be done question. But how can we deal with this very serious economic but also spatial inequality? Is there any cure for it?
No. And, I think we're in the most dangerous moment. I'm a pretty good student of American history. I have never could have imagined, and Jane Jacobs, I always said, was the most prescient person I've ever met. She anticipated back to the city. She anticipated cities as the center of wealth generation. Her last book, Caution, Dark Age Ahead. We have a coming dark age with all these crazy reactions and populists and nationalists, and then we get Trump. I'm worried about two things. One, I'm worried about the backlash in our society and the anger and the divisiveness. Two, I'm worried that for the first time at a critical moment, when we had the Civil War, we had Abraham Lincoln. We had the Great Depression and World War II. We had Franklin Roosevelt. We have the transition to a knowledge economy and its divides. We've got freaking Trump. So I'm worried about that. But what really worries me, as a supporter of mayors and progressive mayors and a supporter of the new localism, when I look at this, pardon my French, show, which is Amazon HQ2, and I see the mayors that I admire, de Blasio and Garcetti and Peduto, and I could go on a laundry list of these guys, falling all over themselves to hand billions of dollars to a company which, by all accounts, is now a bad company. It treats its hometown Seattle bad, doesn't want to pay its taxes in Seattle, treats its workers bad. And these people falling all over themselves. So, yeah, I'm relatively gloomy. Now, do I think there's hope? Yes. But I think it's a long road, and that we're going to have to build a new kind of progressive movement from the local level up. We're going to have to limit the power of the nation state. We're going to have to make cities get some cojones and make these mayors stand up for what is right to recreate our democracy in this country and build a more, look, I'm not even going to say socialism, a more robust and decent and equitable democratic capitalism. It's a project that's really daunting, and it's going to be a long, hard road.
At the end of your book, you had some concrete proposals about housing policy and service industry pay and such. Were you just feeling some compulsion to be upbeat? Are you really this full of despair?
I don't think there's hope at the national level. I think our hope is to work with these progressive mayors. I think they've disappointed a lot of us with this Amazon thing. But look, we've got to work with these progressive mayors. We've got to count on these contestations and conflicts. We've got to push as hard as we can, and we've got to create equity and inclusion at the local level. There's no way with the divide in Washington, D.C., that we're going to ever get anything done. But yeah, could we make San Francisco more inclusive? Hopefully. Could New York become a beacon of hope and progress? Yes. Could my own Toronto become a better place? Probably. And Detroit and Pittsburgh. I think we're going to, as people who care about a better future, we're going to have to push hard at the local level, and we're going to have to work with our enemies, people on the right, who are also saying, look, Washington is dysfunctional. Let's devolve power to the local level. I'm optimistic, but in the very long run, I think we've got some real struggles ahead of us, and I'm worried about the state of the progressive movement. I really am worried about it. But look, my dad was born in a Great Depression and fought in World War II, and that fought the fascists, and we came out of that in a better place. So yeah, at the end of the day, I'm optimistic. But who could sit here in the face of Trump and Amazon HQ2 and just say, look, everything's rosy? We're in a tough moment in American history and in world history, and we've got to buck up.
And let's hope the climate cooperates.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that upbeat note. We've gone through these moments before. We've come out somewhat better off. These struggles are endemic to human history, and we've just got to point the finger in a progressive direction.
That was the urban theorist Richard Florida. His book, The New Urban Crisis, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It, was published in hardcover last year and is now just out in paperback from Basic. That's it for me, Doug Henwood. Let's go out with this, some of Righteous Woman by Torres, the stage name of Mackenzie Scott. Till next week, bye.